Welcome to the Pistis With Us podcast, where our faith unites us in conversation. You can expect thought-provoking discussions with theologians, pastors, scholars, and all other Christians who share the testimony of God's amazing grace. We invite you to be a part of our community to share your thoughts, questions, and stories. Join the conversation. Thank you for joining another episode of the Pistis With Us podcast. I am Raleigh Clay, and I am joined today by Dr. Glenn Kreider, who's a professor of systematic theology at Dallas Theological Seminary, and he's also a contributing author for Vindicating the Vixens, revisiting sexualized, vilified, and marginalized women of the Bible. So thanks for joining us as we continue this series.
You're welcome. That's a mouthful of a title.
Yes, it is. I usually just say the first part, and I recognize that a lot of authors add the second part after I introduce it. So I'm just going to say it all now and see what happens.
It's good.
So you wrote a chapter in Vindicating the Vixens concerning Eve, and you titled the chapter "The Mother of All Seducers." So I just want to, fresh off, just start there and why that title and maybe talk about some of the connotations or implications that people may have when they think of Eve from a certain tradition.
Yeah, I don't really remember if that was my title or if that was the editor's title. But the challenge with Eve is that she is read one of two ways. Either she is the mother of all seducers, she is the seductive one, and that usually means that all women are viewed as seductresses, or she is easily deceived. And I can imagine that, I should finish that, she's easily deceived, and then she, like all women, are seen as easily deceived. So we have this contradictory contrast in the literature between those who focus on her lack of discernment so that she's easily deceived, which is why women can never be in positions of leadership, or that she is the seductress, and thus women can't be trusted in leadership because they are deceptive and seductress. Probably the title, thinking about it, the title fits better with the one than the other, called the mother of, we could say the mother of all the deceived, but that's, yeah. Probably thinking about a title that included both of those was more challenging than we were thinking about. But I think the easy answer to your question, I think the title was chosen by the editor.
When you say that there's traditions that view her as the seducer or the mother of all seducers, or that seduction is birthed from her or whatever, that you could talk through that a little bit, particularly, and within that, some of how that plays itself out in the church and how the church relates to women, or maybe even a broader context in just how society itself relates to women and how that's come about.
Yeah, the narrative goes all the way back to Genesis 3. And I tried to give a couple of examples from history of how she has been read this way. But that narrative in Genesis 3 is often read, and in my childhood was read, as Adam is off doing man's work, because taking care of the garden, that's man's work. And she's at home, where the serpent comes and seduces her, deceives her. Both of those ideas come into play there. And then she has this elaborate plan to seduce her husband, so that when he comes in, she has somehow prepared a meal and hidden the forbidden fruit in a pie or something. But it's about how much work she went into, how much planning went into being able to seduce him so that he would fall into her sin. The challenge with that story is it's made up. It's not in the text, and in fact, there's compelling evidence from the text. Part of the problem, though, is that we don't have a whole lot of detail in that story.
Right.
But there's compelling evidence in the text. The fact that the the second person pronouns throughout chapter 3 are all plural. That they are together at the beginning as a transition from chapter 2 to 1 to 3. That the text explicitly says in verse 6 that he was with her. It's pretty hard to drive a wedge between them as if they were separated and divided. What I discovered is that narrative is a little less common today, but it's been replaced by another one. That the alternative narrative is that, okay, they were together, and what we see here is a passive male who doesn't lead his wife well, doesn't take charge, but merely follows her. It's kind of a more subtle view of seduction that now blames him for having been taken advantage of, not leading well, which is usually often the language that's used. What makes this problematic, in addition to the fact that it's adding stuff to the biblical story that isn't there. I mean, making up stuff that is rooted in cultural values, not in the biblical values. But the challenge is when women are being raised and trained in churches like that with that tradition, they view themselves as somehow less than, dangerous, and the whole clothing stuff, all those things are wrapped up, I think, in this false narrative that she is a great seducer.
Yeah, and so you gave a couple of examples of how, like, kind of both of those connotations of how she's viewed as a seducer while Adam's off doing something, and then she tricks him almost. So in that way, she's both the seducer and the deceiver.
Yeah, they do come together.
But at least from what I've heard more recently, and I think you mentioned Calvin as one who thought of Adam as way off doing something else. And then some people that follow that tradition, and you could read the book. I'm not trying to call anybody out here, but John Piper and Matt Chandler particularly, in how really Matt Chandler in that quote that you give here about the man being a moron, and like just some of that language of trusting the woman in a sense. And that just seems to have, it doesn't seem to have, that has so many implications for how we treat, view, and understand women in general as men, but particularly in the church, and how we're dividing ourselves based on sex. And I can't help, I've talked to too many women who have grown up in that tradition to see how detrimental with that kind of existential understanding of a woman can be for women, and how dangerous that is for men to be viewing women that way. So if that's the case, and I think we're going to recognize that, yeah, that shouldn't be the case for us and how we view women. And where the deceiver, the woman who's the deceiver, comes along as well into that idea. You go back to before chapter 3 in the book to talk about the being of the man and woman to start with, how God created them. So can you talk through that, and then try to position us in a place of how we should view this narrative? And because you do have later on in that Paul's going to pick up and say that the woman was deceived by the serpent first, and so can you work through those kind of issues a little bit to where we can understand that better? That's a whole lot that I just asked of you.
Yeah, there's about 15 questions in there.
You're welcome.
So one thing I want to say before I go back to the beginning, one is two things I want to say. One is I felt almost guilty using that moron quote because it's way too easy. I mean, this is in fact, a reviewer of the book said I wasn't fair, that that's not fair to use. But I used his words. It's posted on the website. You can listen to the sermon. It's not hidden. And it really is a powerful telling of a particular narrative that is shaping the way men and women relate to one another.
Right, especially as a pastor is doing this and giving a sermon to his church and teaching and exhorting church.
Yeah, this isn't a secret. This isn't hidden. This is a Sunday morning sermon,
right,
which is posted on the website. The second thing I want to say is that what's interesting to me is the link between deception and seductress. So the serpent can easily deceive her because she doesn't have the ability to fend him off, or somehow she's inferior. But then once he deceives her, then she becomes this great seductress. So apparently the fall results in her being much more clever. She becomes like the serpent, who's more shrewd than all the animals. It's a really interesting, which in my mind sounds like a really interesting phenomenon, but it does make sense if you have this narrative that she starts inferior and then she becomes more inferior because of her fall. And what she needs is the man to come along and protect and care for her and to protect the world from the danger that she brings. The real challenge with that, if we're in the narrative that Moses is telling, is that there's no hint of anything like that in the creation narratives. I mean, I take it there are two different, I take it there's significant, there are two different creation narratives. Not that they're contradictory, they're not contradictory, they're complementary. And the first one, the focus is on their equality and their unity, that both the man and the woman created at the same time in the same way, given exactly the same responsibility, do fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth.
Name.
And they have exactly the same name, that they're both called Adam. The significance of which I noticed when in chapter 5, after the fall, the narrator again reminds us that he named both of them Adam. Now, some have argued that Adam is a name for the two of them together, or that somehow the man without the woman is less than fully human, that the two together image God. And that's not in chapter 1. I mean, one of the problems is that people read 1 into 2 and 2 into 1. And if you look at 1, that's not there at all. But then in chapter 2, we have an extended time between the creation of the man and the creation of the woman, which is connected to, my teacher taught me, is connected to his exercising dominion over the animals by naming them. That important, Dr. Merrill argues, is an important part of chapter 2, because 1 emphasizes that they're created in the image of God, responsibility to rule. In chapter 2, Adam rules by naming the animals. And then, because it's not good for the man to be alone, God creates one who corresponds to him. And there's no hint in the text there or anywhere else that Etzer is an inferior person. In fact, that word is consistently used for God in relationship to his people. It's often regularly used in military conquests, so that I don't want to overstate that case. I don't want to solve one problem by swinging the pendulum too far to the other side. But in a lot of ways, I mean, even the language the prophets use describing God as a mother bear and mother lion, she's the protector of her offspring. And in a lot of ways, I think she's a protector of her husband. At least my wife is. I think there's something really powerful in watching her come to the aid of those that she loves. So he creates in chapter 2, he creates the man by forming him out of the dust, breathes into him life. And presumably he creates the woman the same way. He takes something from the man and either expands it, so it's from dust, or he takes more dust. And the text doesn't say, but it seems most likely to me that he breathed into her the breath of life too. And the man wakes up from that surgery and said, Ish Isha.
Yeah.
That's the first time that word shows up.
Yeah.
I am Ish. She is Isha. I can't call her man because she's not man. I call her woman. I call her Isha. What's fascinating about that is because it looks like nerding a bit here. It looks like those two words are connected. They're not. They come from two different roots. It's a fascinating pun and play on words, which some have argued this is where he exercises his authority and dominion over her because he names her. But woman is not a name.
Right.
I mean, she already has a name. Her name is Adam, and which isn't really a name either. That says that she has come from the ground, like he has come from the ground. But woman is not a name. So in chapter 3, after the fall, when the narrator tells us explicitly, and he named her, that's when we get her name. So that every time we tell the story of Adam and Eve, we're using the name that God gave him, the name that he gave her, replacing the name that God gave her, which is it's also interesting to me that the narrator doesn't use her name until we get to chapter 4, and then she speaks. The man doesn't speak throughout these chapters. She's the one who speaks, and then we have all kinds of questions about how to interpret, but that gets a little bit farther afield.
Yeah. So there's a few things in there that I find so interesting in the text. And just like a little bit of Hebrew nerdiness, and you mentioned some of it already, but the idea of the wordplay of Adama and Adam coming from Adama, and then Isha coming from Ish, and there's just something so profound about what's going on, and I think it's the same professor. I think it was Dr. Merrill that said this, so correct me if I'm wrong. That brings out the idea that if hierarchy happens because the woman was taken from the man, then the ground is actually the highest thing because this is what the man the man and woman were taken out of particularly.
That's Merrill's argument.
Yeah. And so there's something that it seems that there's a disconnect that if God has charged Adam with governing the world, to cultivate the garden, to spread it to the rest of the creation, all of that stuff. And this is both of them that he's giving this charge to in chapter 1. That it does seem to me to be a leap that you get to chapter 3 and all of a sudden she's this weak creature who is easily deceived. And then you got to do something with the man was with her. So if we're taking it that the man was actually there, if Adam was there with her, then he's right in there with the conversation of the serpent and the woman. And so then how should we read that story and what's going on with the deception of the woman, the giving to the man, and how should we start to understand those things that does justice to what Moses is saying?
For the sake of our listeners, it might be important to identify Dr. Gene Merrill, who's a longtime Southern Baptist deacon. He's been teaching. He taught at Dallas Seminary for years, teaches at Southern Seminary. This is not some young fringe. This is a Hebrew scholar,
right?
And he taught Old Testament and Hebrew for years. You put your finger, I think, on one of the key methodological concerns. Moses tells the story. We should let Moses tell the story that Moses tells. Speculation is fun, and finding ways to understand the text, comparing it, and we're looking at backgrounds and all kinds of things are important to understand the text. But the reading into the text or speculating beyond what the text says, it seems to me, and I know it does to you too, is a path that is fun, maybe, but really not that helpful. Because there is so little detail here. What we see is particularly important, and that sounds almost so obvious. But we merely hear the serpent show up. One other thing first, chapter 2 and 3 are one long narrative.
Right.
I mean, it's evident in the name for God and the way that the story unfolds. The serpent shows up. Where'd the serpent come from? And what is the serpent? It's obviously a creature. It cannot be the creator. It cannot be another god. And we'd have all kinds of other problems. So all kinds of speculation about the serpent. And when the serpent asks the simple question, I read this story, by the way, as although she's the one who is mentioned, he's standing right there. So the conversation is between both Adams when the serpent shows up. Did God really say? And she said, no, God did say we can't eat it, can't even touch it, or we will die. Speculation about how she knew that, it seems to me pretty obvious. He told her. I mean, she wasn't there in chapter 2 when God gave those instructions, but it seems pretty obvious that he told her. And it seems pretty obvious to me that she understood. I mean, people say she embellished, she added to the text when she said, don't even touch it. But that's what preachers do all the time.
Right.
They
don't even get close to that thing. Like,
yeah. I mean, she understood, get away from it.
Yeah.
And then we have the conflict in this story. God said, in the day you eat, you will die. The serpent said, in the day you eat, you will not die. I'm still looking for deception.
Did you say that? So I brought this up in a Bible study on Sunday morning a few weeks. Actually, it's been a year now. It seems like a few months ago. We started this Roman Bible study, and I started with the idea of what is truth. This is what we're trying to get to in studying the scriptures, truth and understanding who God's revealed himself to be in the story. And so I use this because the biblical authors recognize the serpent as the one who has been the deceiver. He was a liar from the beginning. And so we don't know who the serpent is in the story until much later. And so the way that we understand that might not be the way that Moses' audience understood that, but that's a little besides what I'm trying to get at. But I brought up this idea of whether the serpent meant to deceive her, but he didn't actually deceive her. Because what he says is going to happen or not going to happen is actually what doesn't happen.
Or does happen.
Yeah. Right. And
you will be like God, knowing good and evil.
And that's exactly God attests to that later on. They have to be removed. They've become like gods. Now we have to remove them from the garden. And so what's happening there, was he lying? Was the serpent lying? And just what he said was actually true because of what came about. It's really interesting in how we understand what's going on in that story, because what the serpent says or doesn't say happens or doesn't happen. And so when you see it from that perspective, like he might have intended to deceive her, but where the serpent came from is enough. And why is this animal talking?
Because it probably hasn't been that long since they were created. Maybe animals talked, or maybe this animal talked, but they hadn't had experience with animals to know that. I mean, the serpent's a really fascinating figure in that story because we read it knowing, because we've read to the end of the book, we know what Revelation 12 says, we know what's at play there. So yeah, a couple of things here. The serpent explicitly contradicts God. Again, I don't see deception there. This is a flat out contradiction. The language is exactly the same with the negation. It's word for word the same. But then he says that you will be like God's, knowing good and evil. And maybe that's the deception. Maybe this deception is that eating the fruit of the tree would not be good for them, but he wants them to think it would be good for them. But then we have exactly what you said. When the Lord shows up, he said what the serpent said was true. Now, whether the serpent intended that, I have a theory. We have theories about all kinds of things.
All kinds of things.
My theory is that the serpent believed that when the Lord said, the day you eat, you will die, that's exactly what would happen. So his plan from the very beginning of God's plan for the earth, his plan is to destroy it. His plan is to thwart it. His plan is to do what he can to stop God's plan from succeeding.
Anti-creation.
This is who he is. This is who the serpent is throughout the biblical story. The deceiver, counterfeiter, antagonist, all of that, adversary, the very name. So I suspect what the serpent thought would happen, knowing that God is trustworthy, knowing that God is good, knowing
And he's
that
not going to lie.
He's not going to lie. He knows all of that. I think he expected, I get them to eat the fruit of the tree, I'm going to watch them drop dead. And they didn't.
Right.
And I think within seconds, he is thinking, well, when God shows up, then they're going to get it. When your dad gets home. And the Lord speaks, judges him, judges them. And he's still got a couple of hours left in the day. And I think he slithers out the next morning, and he looks at them still there and says, oh, crud. He probably used a stronger word. This is not going to end well. And I think what God is doing there, what Moses wants to understand that God is doing there, is that God's mercy and grace always gets the last word. He is not about to allow the adversary to destroy his plan at the very beginning of that plan. Some people read that story, and I'm sensitive to this idea, as well. They died spiritually; they were separated from God. But they didn't die physically. I think if you read Genesis 1-3 in the context of the ancient Near East, in the context of the people of Israel, what they expected to happen, what they would understand death as physical death, which is actually what happens. It just doesn't happen immediately. And that's not a sign of God's deception, God being dishonest. It's not God failing to do what he said. It actually is what God consistently does in the biblical story. He responds to rebellion with mercy and grace and redemption. And I think in the biblical story, that 1,000 years is a pretty significant number, and that Adam lives almost 960, whatever it was. It's 1,000 years, give or take. And I think that's his, ready for the dad joke, I think that's God's way of rubbing the serpent's nose in the dirt. Yeah. And I can't prove this either, but I think Adam, male and female, came into the world together at the same time, and I think both of them died at the same time. There's not women don't generally show up in genealogies, except when they do, and they're particularly significant when they do.
Quite significant.
Another part of God's gracious redemption of women throughout the biblical story. And some of them a couple of them are, at least one of them, is a bit of a seductress. As Tamar seduces Judah to do what the law had said he should do, and he refused to do.
Yeah, and I think that we're going to talk to somebody about that.
I think she's in the book too.
There's a couple of things that I want to bring up there that you touched on that I think is important within that story. One is the issue of death, and I'm sensitive to the spiritual death thing too. I don't hold that view too heavily. That and I think even when Paul's talking about it, that this idea is expounded maybe too far than where Paul's going. Especially, it seems that he has this mind of death being this ruler over that reigns over God's world. That was never supposed to be. He comes in because of Adam's sin. However we want to understand that exactly. But he comes in because of Adam's sin, and now he's reigning over the world. So all of us are now under the reign of death itself. And then something does die pretty quickly within that story. It's not the Adams that die, but something dies there. And that's really important, that almost right away, when sin hits the ground, so to speak, as this cosmic ruler that comes in, that death happens, physical death happens, but it's not the Adams. But there's a sacrifice also that seems to happen right away, at least in the ears of these Israelites who Moses is writing to, going into this new land to explain to them who this God is that took them out of Egypt while they were worshiping all the Egyptian gods or whatever for 400 years. And and revealing within the story right away, there's sacrifice for sin, and there's death that is owed to sin, and then with everyone being under the reign of death, you have by like page 5 of the Bible, and he died, and he died, and he died, and he died, and then a glimmer of hope. Enoch did not. He was he walked with God, and God took him. And so that seems to be really profound in what's going on with the story. That's at least when I hear the telling of that story, most often that it's overlooked in a lot of ways, so yeah, I try to hold on to that very tightly in understanding that story, that what God said would happen did happen, just not to the people because of his mercy, that he sends a substitute or provides a substitute, so to speak, for the people.
But it did happen for them. It just didn't happen
right
immediately because God is faithful to his promise. He's faithful to his word.
Right.
And that eventually they did die. The challenge, I think, the problem, if you will, the reason why I'm uncomfortable, multiple reasons, treating death as separation and spiritual death and physical death and second death and eternal death, is that we haven't actually defined the term.
Right.
And secondly, what often happens is that spiritual death is seen as somehow worse than physical death. Yeah. That I think it's better to view death as the cessation of life, and that ultimately what's being described in death is the eschatological fate of all living things. Everybody dies, everything dies, except those who don't, like Enoch, which is, I'd say it's a little more than a glimmer of hope in that story.
Right, sure,
It's a powerful spotlight of hope in the midst of this death. But you're also right that without a great deal of detail, the narrator tells us that God made garments of skin for them. And the Israelites who are reading this story know exactly where those garments of skin came from. Remember, we're in 2 and 3. In chapter 2, God creates using his hands and the dust of the earth. He becomes a tailor, and he tans the hides, and he tailors nice clothes for them. Those animals died instead of them. So there is a sense in which death entered the living creatures that day when God introduces what becomes this major theme in the biblical story of substitutionary atonement, that animals die instead of the sinful humans. But eventually, they all die. And it's a subject for another day, probably, but since I poked the elephant. And I'll just answer my own question. Even the atoning sacrifices of animals doesn't solve our problem, and even the atoning work of Christ doesn't solve our problem, that we're still going to die. But what the atoning work does is it provides forgiveness and provides relationship, and it provides the hope and promise that death doesn't get the last word, that there is life after death.
Yeah, there's something in that, in the understanding that death enters the world, that I've just started to really ponder. That in the Genesis 3 narrative, with when he's cursing the serpent, God's cursing the serpent, and he tells him that the seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent, the serpent will crush the head of the seed of the woman, and there's something there, that death enters the picture, and that it's by death or through death that the serpent's head gets crushed, because death doesn't hold the one who crushes the serpent's head. And there's just something so beautiful in that picture that doesn't come to fruition until much later in the story, and so there's something remarkable about this side of history that we find ourselves on, that when I'm reading the story that the Israelites were hearing, or that the Hebrews were hearing coming out of this, that they don't know yet. And there's just something remarkable about God's progressive revelation and how that's going to unfold, and what they would have even understood that to be, in trying to like, okay, well, that word seed is used often in the biblical narrative, and the promises of God that there's going to be a seed from Abraham, there's going to be a seed from David, and then all of that seed comes together in Jesus himself, and then his progeny, so to speak, those who are of faith and are incorporated into him, are the inheritors of all that's his. And there's just something beautiful about the way that story unfolds in that original promise, that there's a consequence for the rebellion of the Adams there, but within that consequence, there's a promise of renewal and redemption, and the rest of I think the redemption story starts, I think, at chapter 1, page 1, but it does push, and there in chapter 3, there's a pivotal movement of the promise on how this might work itself out.
And it becomes more and more clear as more and more revelation, as more and more of the plan unfolds. The Israelites don't understand the sacrificial system either.
Right.
This is, if they had, they would not have taken it as flippantly, apparently, as they did at times. But I mean, this is the way typology works. In order to see all those types, you need to see the antitype. Along comes Jesus, who is the seed, because there is no seeds.
Right.
All of that, that pun that Paul uses. He said the seed, not seeds, because there was one seed. That then they begin to see. Later generations begin to look and see how those things all come together. So, that's what was going on back there.
Right. So there's something else within that narrative that I want you to touch on, and we've kind of poked at it a little bit. But after the rebellion or the fall, Adam names Eve, and that's significant. But I've heard it viewed several different ways now, and so I have a professor that says, it's not an issue of that he named her, but what he named her. And
this professor believes exactly the opposite.
Right, and that's, I know both of you. And so can you talk to that, though? Because that I've read that more than once now, and heard it more since I've heard him say it. And so can you talk through that a little bit, and maybe the implications that come out through that?
This is also should give credit to Dr. Merrill, who was the first person who helped me to see the significance of naming. And that naming in the ancient world, naming in our world, naming in most cultures in human history, are from a position of power and authority. So parents named their children, slaves were named by the masters. It's from a position of power and authority. And when we read this story, chapter 1, they both get the same name. In chapter 2, there are no names, and Adam is used a couple of times, but the whole emphasis in chapter 2 is on their equality and their unity. I think we could say that, Ish and Ishah. And when the judgment oracle is pronounced, and the Lord either leaves or he stops speaking, the very next words that Adam named his wife smack us right between the ears, or at least they should, because we have just heard earlier in this narrative that Adam gave names to all the animals in the beginning, long time ago. A little cue Bob Dylan children's song. And I mean, it just seems to me the significance of this man who thinks it is his place to change his wife's name from the one God gave her to something. I mean, names are really important. Even in our day, we wrestle with the use of nicknames. My wife's name is Janice. That is her work name. Only her close friends call her Jan. So when somebody in the workplace calls her Jan, she will often stop them. That's not my name. And you say, well, why is she so sensitive? Okay, Fred. Like we all want to be called the name we want to be called.
Right.
So if she would want people to call her by her nickname, that would be fine. But I think it's rude and it's disrespectful not to call people the names that they have chosen. And if they choose to change their name, I think we should honor them and respect them and call them the name they want to be named. But for somebody to think it is his place to change her name, it seems to me is the height of inappropriateness. How's that for a weak word? People have pushed back against my view to say two things. One, but what do you do with that story in Genesis 16 where Hagar names God? That's exactly the point. The fact that the Lord, the creator of the universe, the God of Abraham, allows this Egyptian slave woman who is Abraham's wife to name her and to name him is exactly the point of his condescension, his humility for her sake in order to elevate her. Because when she goes back to Abraham, she not only relates to him what God had told her, and he believes her. She names the place. Moses said that place still has the same name today, names her son. I mean, that naming motif there, instead of being an argument against my view, I think is actually an argument for my view. But what does he name her? He names her Eve, which would be because she will be the mother of all the living. Many people think that's that's Adam's. Those are Adam's words. I think it's at least as legitimate that those are the narrator's words. Moses does something very similar with Joseph at the end of the story, where Joseph says, "What you did was evil. You sold me into slavery. That was evil. It's despicable. That there's nothing good in that." But God used it to save your lives. God brought good out of it. And there's a sense in which I think the narrator is telling us that what he meant to dominate and control her is actually the means by which God brings salvation into the world. She is not only the mother of the living, she's the mother of life. There is no you, there is no me without Genesis 4, without her giving birth to which is why, and I think that's part of the significance, that when she gives birth to her, what seems to be the firstborn, we don't hear him talk. Adam doesn't say, she says, I have given birth to a man, or maybe the man.
The Ish.
Another point of controversy.
Within that same argument.
Yeah, this for me is not what he named her. Isn't nearly as significant to me as that he names her. And we could argue about whether there's a play on the consonants for serpent. We could argue about all kinds of things there. I really think the naming motif in the Bible and in human history is so overpowering that we are to see that as an exercise of his authority and power over her. I mean, as we watch through the biblical story, when God changes Abram's name, he changes Sarah's name. When God names Abram's first and second son, when God names his own son, I mean, these are not merely relational and familial terms. This is an exercise of authority and power.
And you mentioned that, so if I'm hearing you correctly, what you're arguing for is, at least maybe in some sense, that the narrator inserts a parenthetical statement.
Yeah.
Which would make sense because this wouldn't be the first time that he did this in the narrative. He does it when for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined. There's no father and mother there.
Yeah.
He's explaining something to the Israelites to whom he's writing,
Yeah.
and which is another beautiful concept of the two coming back as one. She was taken from him; they will be one. But so yeah, this isn't foreign or alien to the text or even how ancient Near Eastern writings were written. And I know even by saying other ancient Near Eastern writings, people will get upset that I'm not just paying attention to the Bible but
you're in the Bible. I mean,
right.
you gave
so.
an example from the Bible.
I would like to make that argument. But yeah, so I'm with you. There seems to be, in how the naming works throughout the story, that even maybe, and I think this is what you were alluding to, so correct me, that even in him naming her, there's something of the redemption motif in what's actually going to come through her. And frankly, it goes right into what, if it's a parenthetical statement, if it's an insertion from the narrator's point of view, it goes right into the promise of God that the seed will come. And then you could argue whether did she have the Ish or like, so.
And that seed comes through her.
Right.
That's Eve's Revenge, book title from a decade or so ago.
I don't think I've read that one. Who? Do you know the author?
My mind just went blank.
That's okay. I'll cut it.
Lillian Callis Barger, Barger.
Okay.
Eve's Revenge. I'd recommend it.
We've only kind of brushed on some of the implications of understanding the Eve narrative in our current situatedness and culture and within even churchianity as a whole, and how we're taking the roles. And because there does seem to be, in some ways, and I think there's exceptions that kind of prove the rule, that a particular complementarian reading of the story might have a leaning towards understanding Eve in a certain way in a hierarchy relationship. Not always, so I'm not trying to paint with too broad of strokes here. But then a more egalitarian leaning would push towards another understanding of the Eve and Adam. And I know what camp that you're in, and I know your view there. And so it wouldn't be fair to paint completely with those with that brush. And so within the narrative, if we're not talking about hierarchy and we're talking about equality, how would that then affect the way that we understand women relationships and men and women relationships, but women roles even maybe in the church? Is that too loaded?
There is nothing. No, it's not. There is nothing in Genesis 1 and 2 read in that order and read not anticipating what is to come that indicates any hierarchy of men over women. What happens fairly early, like immediately after the rebellion and the fall, is that patriarchy becomes the dominant motif. And I think that's fairly easily understood. One, where men are following Adam and having dominion over her. But it also, it's understandable because of the tendency towards this power differential. I mean, and then we come to the law of Moses, which is very patriarchal in its approach, which leads some people to say this is God's intention, this is God's design. But I think the major issue here is the way this story shows up in the New Testament. There are only twice that the New Testament writers refer to Eve and her deception. The first is in 2 Corinthians 13, where Paul is obviously sarcastic and mocking. I'm concerned that false teachers might come in and deceive you like Eve was deceived. He's not concerned about that at all. He knows exactly that's what's happening. That's why he's writing to them. The second place is in 1 Timothy 2, where Paul, in some people's reads, seems to be saying that the reason why he doesn't allow women to teach or exercise authority over men is because Adam was created first and because she was deceived and became a sinner. Which is a really interesting way to read Genesis 3, because Paul's theology consistently is that sin entered the world through one man.
Right.
Maybe Adam there refers to both men and women, but Paul's not blaming woman for sin entering the world. He's blaming Adam. He's placing the blame on Adam. He's attributing it to Adam. Adam is the cause. I'm trying to use respectful language. So it seems kind of odd to me. I don't have an answer that completely satisfies me, but it does seem odd that Paul would seem to imply in 1 Timothy 2 that women are inferior because of the order of creation and because of the deception. What's fascinating to me about that, I'm not dismissing that text. I wrestle, as you know, hard with that text.
Sure.
And recent podcast you did with Dr. Glahn wrestles with that too. What I'm trying to do is to read this text in the context of the narrative of redemption and the biblical story. And it strikes me as really odd that all of a sudden, near the end of the canon, the order of creation is now somehow a big deal. That doesn't seem, I mean, we didn't see that before. And there's a whole lot of stuff going on in 1 Timothy 2 that we don't practice, like men raising holy hands when they pray and all of those kind of things. So you may say, how does this come around to answering your question? I don't know, but I thought I wanted to say that. No, I think it does come around because as we go all the way back, this is my conviction, and then I'll answer your specific question. It is my conviction that we should read the original creation as what God intended for a time. It wasn't his ultimate plan, we know. When he separates the light from the darkness, eventually the darkness is gone. The serpent is still there, has access. I mean, all those reasons why the original creation was good but not perfect, which sets up the fall, which is the world in which we live. And then ultimately God redeems all creation and everything is made new, and that we actually do live in a perfect world forever and ever because of the resurrection of the dead. And even those who didn't die because they happened to be alive at Christ's return are glorified. And so we look back at original creation and say, how can we emulate this? Instead of blessing and endorsing what God has cursed, we should be looking at what God blessed in the original creation. And then we look at the new creation and say, what should we be working towards? What ought to draw us forward? And I simply can't conceive that in the original creation, because there's no hint of it, and in the new creation, there would be this hierarchy of men over women. I can't conceive there'd be hierarchy of men over men. The fact that you're better at certain things than I am doesn't make you better than me. Right. You're just better at me than certain things, like playing guitar. I'm not good at that. Not good isn't even close to how horrible I am at that. So that I think, here's why this matters. That when there's conflict, it's never good. And when hierarchy is imported into a text and into a world where it doesn't belong, that is never good. That we should be looking for, we should be creating spaces, and we should be empowering both men and women to be what God created them to be. I am a complementarian. I believe, my institution affirms that only men can serve as elders. But apart from that that one single limitation, I don't see any other limitations. And I would say a bit snarkily, imagine that, that in in a marriage relationship where somebody has to get the last word, you actually have a significant problem. You should be working on the problem rather than perpetuating the problem by creating a vote system and a hierarchy. And I know people are going to say, but somebody eventually has to decide. I don't know why. I mean, no decision is a no decision. And I think I think what the strong complementarians have done is that they've created a theological justification for that hierarchy. I think what strong egalitarians have done is that they have removed the key differences between men and women. They've ignored what is obvious in the difference between men and women. And ultimately, I think, final word, I don't think roles is the most important thing. That who takes out the trash and who mows the lawn. I mean, those are insignificant in comparison to the things that really should matter. And what I see in Genesis 2, this is the reason why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two become one flesh. They don't cease to be two. They're still two, but they are united. You say, well, why does that matter? Because this is the gospel, Paul says. Right. In Ephesians. It's all this. I'm not even talking about relationship between men and women at all. I'm talking about the gospel, how we are all united to Christ. And we are one, but we're not the same. Right. We get to carry each other. We each contribute something to the whole. And what we contribute to the whole is not job descriptions.
Right.
Like this whole job description approach to the Trinity and to human relationships, I think, is unhealthy. Does that mean the jobs don't matter? No, silly one. Of course they matter, but they're not necessarily hierarchical.
Right.
Although I'd like to think that the guy who can play bass guitar really well is more valuable to the kingdom than those who can't.
I agree completely.
I'm jealous.
Nice. Well, I appreciate you coming on.
See what I did there, by the
way? I mean, it looked like good form from here. That's great. I appreciate you coming on again and being willing to talk about actually a really remarkable and vilified character in the scripture. And saying even character doesn't sound appropriate, but yeah, just an incredible person through whom God promised to redeem the world. And so, thanks so much. I think this has really been great.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you for joining the Pistis With Us podcast. To keep the conversation going beyond the camera, be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and subscribe to our YouTube page, as well as wherever you listen to your podcasts.